In the spring of 1942, the Soviet Union was on the brink of disaster. German troops were preparing for a decisive strike that could break the USSR's resistance. At this critical moment, Stalin made an unprecedented decision to send his closest ally, Vyacheslav Molotov, to negotiate with the Allies. But the route lay through enemy-occupied Europe, teeming with fighter planes and anti-aircraft batteries. One of the most influential men in the country had to risk his life for the sake of a diplomatic mission. This is a story about how high politics demanded personal courage, and the fate of the anti-Hitler coalition depended on one risky flight. Subscribe to our channel to learn more incredible stories from wartime. And in the comments, discuss whether you think it was justified to take such a huge risk with the life of a high-ranking official for the sake of diplomatic negotiations. Could the history of the war have turned out differently if Molotov's mission had ended tragically? May 1942 was one of the most alarming months for the Soviet Union since the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. The Red Army had just suffered a catastrophic defeat near Kharkov, where hundreds of thousands of soldiers were surrounded. The German command was completing preparations for a large-scale summer offensive, which was supposed to lead the Wehrmacht to the oil fields of the Caucasus and finally break the resistance of the USSR. Moscow understood that without the help of its allies, it would be incredibly difficult to survive. Joseph Stalin closely followed developments on the front and behind the scenes of world diplomacy. Correspondence with Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt was regular, but words needed to be backed up by deeds. The Soviet leader insisted on opening a second front in Europe, which would divert significant German forces from the east. The Western Allies promised, but gave no specifics. Lend-Lease was working, but its volumes remained insufficient to meet the enormous needs of the Red Army. The Kremlin realized that personal negotiations at the highest level were necessary. Telegrams and letters could not convey the urgency of the situation, the critical nature of the moment. A person was needed who could speak on behalf of Stalin and convince the Allies of the need for decisive action right now, in the spring and summer of 1942. There was no time to waste. Every day of delay cost thousands of lives at the front. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the strategic initiative was still in Germany's hands. The Wehrmacht controlled vast territories from the Atlantic coast to the Volga, from Norway to North Africa. Any flight across Europe meant mortal danger. German fighters patrolled the skies, radars tracked the airspace, and anti-aircraft batteries were ready to open fire on any suspicious target. Sending a high-ranking Soviet official on such a journey seemed insane. But there was no time to think. Intelligence reported a concentration of German troops in the south. Operation Blau, a general offensive on Stalingrad and the Caucasus, was being prepared. If the Germans succeeded, the war could be lost. Guarantees of assistance, clear commitments from the Allies, and specific deadlines for opening a second front were needed. This required an envoy capable of negotiating on equal terms with the leaders of the great powers. Stalin summoned Vyacheslav Mikhailovich Molotov. The USSR's People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs was one of the few people whom the Soviet leader trusted unconditionally. Molotov had participated in all key negotiations since the beginning of the war, knew all the nuances of relations with the Allies, possessed iron composure, and the ability to get his way at the negotiating table. It was he who signed the pact with Ribbentrop in 1939, and it was he who led all the most important diplomatic battles of recent years. The conversation was short and extremely specific. Molotov was to fly to London and Washington for personal meetings with Churchill and Roosevelt. The main task was to obtain firm promises to open a second front in 1942 and increase Lend-Lease supplies. The mission was so important that it justified any risk, even the risk of losing one of the country's top leaders. Molotov understood the danger of the upcoming trip. He would have to fly over enemy-controlled territory. German pilots dreamed of such a trophy, Shooting down a plane with the Soviet People's Commissar on board would be a propaganda victory of colossal proportions. But there was no choice. The fate of the country demanded that the risk be taken, and Vyacheslav Mikhailovich agreed. Feverish preparations began for an unprecedented diplomatic mission. It was necessary to plan the route, ensure security, and prepare the necessary documents and materials for the negotiations. Every detail mattered. The slightest mistake could cost not only Molotov's life, but also the lives of all the members of the delegation. But the stakes were too high to abandon this risky venture. In the spring of 1942, the Soviet Union needed real help, not words of support, and Molotov set out to get it at any cost. The decision to send Molotov to London and Washington was made by Stalin alone, without discussion in the Politburo. The Soviet leader understood that such a mission required absolute secrecy. Any leak of information could turn the diplomatic visit into a suicidal venture. German intelligence was closely monitoring the movements of the Soviet leadership, and news of Molotov's flight would have triggered a massive manhunt in the air. Therefore, the circle of those in the know was extremely small. Vyacheslav Mikhailovich received clear instructions. The main goal was to obtain specific commitments from the Allies to open a second front. Not vague promises in the near future, but precise dates and the scale of the operation. Stalin insisted that the invasion of Europe take place in the summer or fall of 1942. Every month of delay strengthened Germany's position and weakened the USSR. The Red Army was bleeding on the front lines, and help was needed immediately. The second task concerned Lend-Lease. Supplies of military equipment, raw materials, and food from the US and Britain were coming in, but their volumes did not cover the needs. There was a particularly acute shortage of aircraft, trucks, locomotives, and aluminum for the aviation industry. Molotov had to convince the Allies to increase aid and speed up delivery. Soviet industry was working at full capacity, and evacuated factories were just beginning to pick up speed. Without external support, it was impossible to hold the front. The third important issue was the post-war structure of Europe. Stalin wanted guarantees that Soviet interests in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states would be recognized. The war was still raging, but it was already necessary to lay the foundations for a future peaceful settlement. Molotov knew that the British and Americans were wary of Soviet plans, but the current situation gave Moscow bargaining chips. In preparation for the trip, Molotov studied all available materials on the positions of Western leaders. Churchill was famous for his unpredictability and oratory skills. The British Prime Minister was a staunch opponent of communism, but a pragmatist when it came to the war. It would not be easy to convince him of the need to open a second front urgently. The British still remembered the disaster at Dunkirk and feared a repeat. Roosevelt seemed to be a more agreeable partner. The American president understood global strategy and realized that the USSR was now bearing the brunt of the fight against Germany. But even he could not act alone. Behind him stood the generals, Congress, and public opinion. Convincing America to move from words to large-scale action required compelling arguments and diplomatic skill of the highest order. Molotov's personal safety worried Stalin no less than the results of the mission. The loss of the foreign minister would have been not only a human tragedy, but also a serious blow to the prestige of the USSR. German propaganda would have exploited this to the fullest. Therefore, special precautions were taken. Molotov had to fly under an assumed name, and the route was kept strictly secret. Even the members of the delegation were not informed of the details until the last moment. The composition of the delegation was formed. In addition to Molotov, it included military advisors, translators, and experts on economic issues. Each member was vetted by special departments of the NKVD. Information leaks were ruled out. Everyone understood that the fate of millions of people on the front lines depended on the success of this mission. The negotiations had to produce concrete results that would help the Red Army withstand the upcoming battles. At the same time, route options were being worked out. The direct route through Europe was the shortest, but also the most dangerous. German fighters controlled all airspace from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. A detour through the Arctic and the Atlantic increased travel time, but reduced risks. In the end, a combined option was chosen. First, through the north to Great Britain, then across the ocean to the United States, and back again via the northern route. Each stage had its own dangers, but there was no alternative. Molotov understood that this journey could be the last of his life. Even optimists were skeptical about the chances of surviving the flight over enemy territory. But there was no turning back. The country was in mortal danger, and its salvation required risking everything. Vyacheslav Mikhailovich was ready for this. The party and Stalin entrusted him with a mission of exceptional importance, and he would carry it out at any cost. Preparations for the flight began in an atmosphere of strict secrecy. The best specialists from the Red Army, Air Force, and civil aviation were involved. It was necessary to choose an aircraft capable of flying thousands of kilometers over enemy territory and the ocean. Ordinary military aircraft were not suitable for such a task. Range, reliability, and at least minimal protection were needed. After lengthy discussions, the choice fell on the American B-24 Liberator bomber, received under Lend-Lease. The aircraft had a long range and could carry a significant payload. Its 4 engines provided the necessary reliability. Even if one engine failed, the aircraft could continue flying. Its high ceiling allowed it to evade enemy fighters, although it did not guarantee complete safety. The cabin was specially converted for important passengers. Additional fuel tanks were installed, and every component and unit was checked. The slightest malfunction in the air could result in disaster. The crew was selected with particular care. The commander was experienced pilot Endus Pusep, who had thousands of hours of flight time and a reputation as a cool-headed professional. Navigator Ivan Obukov was renowned for his ability to plot routes in all conditions and navigate even in the complete absence of ground references. The radio operator, flight engineer, and gunners, all crew members, underwent special screening by the NKVD. They were entrusted with keeping state secrets and were responsible for the life of one of the country's leaders. The route was planned with risk minimization in mind. The first stage was a flight from Moscow north to the Murmansk or Arkhangelsk area. From there, across the Barents Sea to Great Britain. This section was relatively safe. German aviation was less active here than in Central Europe. But even here, dangers lurked. The weather in the Arctic was extremely unpredictable. Visibility could drop to 0 in a matter of minutes, and icing threatened all aircraft that ventured into high latitudes. The departure time was chosen, taking into account many factors. It was necessary to fly through the most dangerous areas in the dark, when the likelihood of encountering enemy fighters was reduced. But night flying created additional difficulties for navigation. Every detail was discussed and calculated. Alternate airfields in case of a forced landing, radio call signs for communication with allies, procedures in case of enemy attack. Nothing was left unconsidered. Molotov prepared for the trip not only psychologically, but also practically. He was given a warm flight jacket, a life jacket, and an oxygen mask for high-altitude flights. He was instructed on the rules of conduct in case of an emergency. He was taught how to use a parachute, although the chances of survival when jumping over the ocean or enemy territory were considered minimal. Vyacheslav Mikhailovich listened to all the instructions with his characteristic composure. Fear was not characteristic of him, and if it was, no one saw it. At the same time, diplomatic preparations were underway. The British and Americans were informed of the upcoming visit, but only in the most general terms. The exact time of arrival was kept secret until the last moment. The Allies were surprised. Sending a high-ranking official on such a dangerous journey seemed to them an unnecessary risk. But this showed how seriously the USSR took the negotiations, and how critical the situation on the Eastern Front was. London was preparing to receive its distinguished guest. Churchill ordered that the visit be kept as secret as possible. Molotov was to arrive incognito, under the fictitious name of Mr. Brown. No public events were planned. All meetings and negotiations were to take place behind closed doors. British counterintelligence feared German agents who might try to organize an assassination attempt. The security of the Soviet People's Commissar was becoming a headache for Her Majesty's secret services. The last days before the flight to Moscow were tense. Molotov was finishing up his current affairs, giving instructions to his deputies, and preparing materials for the negotiations. Stalin met with him almost daily, clarifying positions on various issues. The Soviet leader understood perfectly well that the outcome of the war could depend on the results of this trip. A second front could turn the tide, force Hitler to spread his forces thin, and give the USSR a much-needed respite. But it would not be easy to convince the Allies to act decisively. All hope rested on Molotov. The flight route was an extremely complex puzzle. The direct route from Moscow to London passed through territories tightly controlled by the Luftwaffe. German fighters were based in Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and France. Radar stations formed a continuous early warning network. Anti-aircraft artillery covered all strategically important objects. Attempting to cross enemy airspace, even at night, meant almost certain death. A detour was needed, as far away from the enemy's main forces as possible. The planners settled on the northern option. The plane was to take off from Moscow and head for Arkhangelsk. From there, it would cross the Barents Sea to the northern coast of Norway, then past Iceland to the shores of Scotland. This route added thousands of kilometers, but reduced the risk of encountering the enemy. The Arctic regions were less saturated with German troops, although Luftwaffe units were based there, hunting Allied convoys. German bases in Norway posed a particular danger. Hitler attached great importance to the Norwegian direction, fearing a possible Allied landing. Fighter and bomber squadrons, submarines, and surface ships were stationed there. Norwegian fjords served as a refuge for the German fleet, including the battleships Tirpitz and Scharnhorst. Flying past the Norwegian coast, Soviet aircraft risked being detected and attacked. Weather conditions added to the uncertainty. May in the Arctic is a time of white nights and unpredictable weather. Fog could hide the aircraft from the enemy, but it also made navigation difficult. Storms over the ocean could knock even an experienced pilot off course. Icing on the wings and fuselage threatened to cause a loss of control. Every hour of flight brought new challenges for the crew and passengers, but it was too late to turn back. The decision had been made, the order given. The backup plan was to land in Murmansk or at one of the northern airfields in case of technical problems or deteriorating weather. However, these bases themselves were subject to regular raids by German aircraft. A delay on the ground could lead to the discovery of an important passenger by German agents or the bombing of the airfield. Therefore, the task was extremely clear: to fly non-stop to British territory. The crew had to cope with any difficulties in the air. Communication with the ground was planned to be minimal. Radio communications could be intercepted by German radio intelligence. Experienced Luftwaffe radio operators were able to determine not only the call signs, but also the approximate location of the aircraft based on the nature of the transmissions. Therefore, a special radio silence regime was developed to communicate only in critical situations and only with coded messages. Navigation was to be based on astronomical observations and route calculations. In 1942, refueling in the air was not yet widely used. The B-24 had to fly at maximum range, using all fuel tanks. Calculations showed that under favorable conditions, there would be just enough fuel with a minimal reserve. Headwinds, avoiding thunderstorm fronts, and maneuvers to evade the enemy could all lead to a fuel shortage. In that case, the crew would have to land on water or look for the nearest shore. The chances of survival were estimated to be extremely low.
The British promised to provide fighter escorts for the last leg of the route.
As soon as the Soviet aircraft entered the Royal Air Force's area of operation, it would be met and escorted to the airfield. But until that moment, the crew and passengers were left alone to face the dangers. The skies over occupied Europe and the North Atlantic were controlled by the enemy. Every minute of the flight could be their last. Molotov studied the route maps without showing any emotion. He understood the risks, but did not show fear. The members of the delegation looked at the People's Commissar and drew strength from his calmness. If Vyacheslav Mikhailovich himself did not flinch in the face of mortal danger, then they too must be prepared for any outcome. The party had entrusted them with a mission of the utmost importance. The motherland needed their courage, and they would not fail, no matter what happened in the skies over enemy territory. On May 26, 1942, in the pre-dawn twilight, a tense silence reigned at the Moscow airfield. The B-24 stood on the tarmac, ready for takeoff. 4 engines were already warming up, emitting a characteristic roar. The ground crew was completing the final checks. Everyone understood the importance of the moment. A man was boarding the plane whose mission would determine the fate of millions. Secrecy was absolute. Even most of the airfield workers did not know who was embarking on this dangerous flight today. Molotov arrived without pomp and ceremony. A small black car pulled up right next to the gangway. Vyacheslav Mikhailovich got out wearing a warm flight jacket, said a quick goodbye to those seeing him off, and boarded the plane. He was accompanied by several assistants and military advisors. Everyone looked composed and focused. Each of them realized that there was no guarantee of returning from this flight. But the mission required them to risk everything. Crew Commander Endis Pusep reported that they were ready for takeoff. All systems were working normally, and the weather on the first leg of the route was acceptable. Meteorologists promised variable cloudiness without heavy precipitation. Visibility should be sufficient for visual navigation. This was important. In conditions of radio silence, the crew could only rely on their own eyes and instruments. Communication with the ground was kept to a minimum, so as not to reveal the importance of the flight. The engines roared at full power. The heavy machine began to taxi down the concrete runway, picking up speed. The ground receded faster and faster beneath the wheels. Finally, the plane lifted off the ground and soared into the gray pre-dawn sky. Moscow remained below, hidden by a haze. The course was set for the north. Ahead lay thousands of kilometers over hostile territory, the icy ocean, and unpredictable Arctic weather. But there was no turning back. The first hours of the flight passed relatively calmly. The plane gained altitude and headed strictly north, bypassing populated areas and possible positions of German observers. Forests, rivers, and lakes floated by below. Gradually, the landscape became more and more harsh. The trees thinned out, and swamps and tundra appeared. The weather held, although the cloud cover intensified at times. Navigator Abukov constantly checked the map, marking the control points of the route. Molotov settled into a specially equipped compartment. There was not much space, but they made it as comfortable as possible for their important passenger. Vyacheslav Mikhailovich looked through documents, preparing for the upcoming negotiations. The noise of the engines made conversation difficult, and no one felt particularly inclined to talk anyway. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts. Some dozed, trying to gather strength before the long hours of flight. Others simply looked out the windows at the ground passing below. After about 4 hours, the plane reached the Arkhangelsk area. Here, there was a short technical stop for refueling. The landing went smoothly. Everything was ready at the northern airfield. Fuel tanks, a team of mechanics. They worked quickly and efficiently. Every minute on the ground increased the risk of detection. Molotov did not even leave the plane, only peeking out of the hatch to breathe in the cold northern air. In less than an hour, the B-24 was back in the air. Now the most dangerous part of the route began. Ahead lay the Barents Sea, cold, unwelcoming, teeming with German submarines and aircraft. The coast of Norway was saturated with enemy bases.
Any Luftwaffe patrol plane that spotted a lone four-engine bomber would immediately raise the alarm.
A hunt would begin, from which it would be almost impossible to escape. The crew understood that every minute could be fatal.
Giuseppe flew the plane at low altitude,
using the clouds as cover. Periodically, the plane would plunge into a milky white veil, and visibility would drop to zero. They had to rely on their instruments.
Then the clouds would part,
and the steel surface of the ocean would open up below. Cold waves rolled one after another to the horizon. Not a single ship, not a hint of human presence. Only a lifeless expanse of water and the low Arctic sky.
But somewhere here, German submarines were hunting and planes were patrolling.
An encounter with them would spell disaster. Over the Barents Sea, the danger grew with every mile. The crew knew that the Norwegian coast to their left was teeming with German bases. Radar stations constantly scanned the airspace. Even at low altitude, the plane could be detected. And if it was spotted, the reaction would be instantaneous.
Fighter planes would be in the air in a matter of minutes.
The heavy bomber had virtually no chance of escaping the Messerschmitts. Their only hope was luck and bad weather, which would hide the intruder from the enemy's eyes. The weather seemed to hear the crew's pleas. The clouds thickened, and visibility dropped. The plane flew through a milky haze, constantly falling into air pockets. The shaking intensified. Molotov and the members of the delegation fastened their seatbelts. Some began to feel sick. Flying in a turbulent zone required a strong stomach. But these inconveniences seemed minor compared to the threat of being shot down.
The clouds were the best protection from enemy fighters.
Suddenly, the radio operator intercepted German radio communications. The Luftwaffe was sending up a patrol. It was unclear whether this was related to the Soviet aircraft, or simply a routine operation. But the risk increased many times over. Giuseppe decided to change course, deviating even further from the Norwegian coast. This added distance and fuel consumption, but safety was more important. The plane veered to the right, increasing the distance between itself and the German bases. The hours dragged on painfully slowly. The monotonous hum of the engines, the gray haze outside the windows, the constant tension. The gunners kept a close watch on the sky, ready to open fire at the first sign of enemy aircraft. But the sky remained empty. Only clouds, the ocean below, and endless gray haze all around. From time to time, the clouds thinned, and then the crew would freeze, with the silhouettes of fighter planes appear. But the Barents Sea kept its secret, hiding the Soviet plane in its cold embrace. Around noon, an event occurred that could change everything. Through a break in the clouds, the gunner spotted the silhouette of a ship. A lone destroyer was sailing in the distance. British or German, it was impossible to tell. The ship was moving slowly, clearly looking for something. A patrol? Hunting for convoys? Or perhaps searching for downed aircraft? Giuseppe ordered to stay on course. Any maneuver could attract attention. It was better to hope that the observers on the ship would not notice the plane in the clouds. Fortunately, the encounter passed without incident. The destroyer disappeared behind a veil of rain, and the B-24 continued on its way. But the incident showed that even over the deserted sea, danger lurked at every turn. The war had turned the Arctic into a combat zone. Here, every mile of sea route taken by convoys carrying American aid was fought over, and the Soviet plane was crossing this invisible front line. Fuel was being consumed according to calculations. So far, there was enough, but the reserve was dwindling by the hour. Headwinds slowed their progress. Circumventing dangerous areas added kilometers. The flight engineer regularly reported on the condition of the engines. All four were running smoothly, but the load was at its maximum. The failure of even one engine would cause serious problems. It was possible to reach the British coast on 3 engines, but it was extremely risky. The day was drawing to a close when the outline of the coast appeared ahead. Iceland. This island served as an important base for the Allies, controlling the sea lanes in the North Atlantic. British and American aircraft patrolled from here, hunting for German submarines. The appearance of an unidentified four-engine bomber could cause alarm, but the documents stated that a code signal should be sent when approaching Iceland. The radio operator went on the air with a coded message. The response came almost instantly.
The Allies were expecting a Soviet aircraft,
but only a few people knew exactly where it was and where it was headed. Secrecy was maintained until the very end. Even British air traffic controllers received only minimal information. B-24 was given permission to continue its flight. Ahead lay the last and perhaps safest part of the route. The coast of Scotland was within reach, but it was too early to relax. The sea still held many unpleasant surprises. The gunners did not leave their battle stations. German submarines were operating even in these waters. Some of them were equipped with anti-aircraft guns and could attack low-flying aircraft. An encounter with a surfaced submarine in poor visibility could prove fatal. Therefore, vigilance did not waver for a moment. Everyone understood that there were only a few hours left until the end of the dangerous flight. But it was these last hours that could be the most critical. Molotov would occasionally approach the porthole and look at the gray waters of the ocean. What was the People's Commissar thinking about at that moment? The upcoming negotiations? About what arguments to use to convince the Allies? Or simply about whether they would even make it to their destination alive and unharmed? Vyacheslav Mikhailovich did not share his thoughts, but his calmness was contagious to everyone on board. If Molotov himself showed no fear, then there was every reason for optimism. Meanwhile, the radio operator continued to intercept messages. German patrols had become more active. Perhaps they suspected something. Or maybe it was just their usual activity, hunting for Allied convoys. In any case, it was necessary to remain vigilant. The shores of Great Britain loomed ahead. But what awaited the Soviet delegation there? Would they be able to get specific promises from Churchill? Or would the negotiations reach an impasse, as had happened many times before? The answers to these questions could only be found on land, in the offices of the British government. On the evening of May 27th, the shores of Great Britain appeared through the breaks in the clouds. The Scottish hills, covered with heather, looked especially welcoming after long hours over the cold ocean. The crew breathed a sigh of relief. The most dangerous part of the route was behind them. Ahead lay friendly territory, where the Soviet aircraft was not threatened by Luftwaffe fighters. But it was too early to relax. Landing in an unfamiliar place and under conditions of strict secrecy required extreme concentration. British air traffic controllers directed the B-24 to a military airfield near Glasgow. The runway was cleared of other aircraft. Security services cordoned off the surrounding area. Even the airfield personnel received only minimal information about the incoming flight. Mr. Brown, as he was listed in the documents, was to land incognito. No welcoming ceremonies, no unnecessary witnesses. Only the most essential people knew about the visit of the high-ranking Soviet guest. The landing proceeded as planned. Pusep masterfully landed the heavy aircraft on the rain-soaked runway. The wheels touched the concrete, and the plane rolled toward its parking spot, spraying water as it went. The engines gradually fell silent. After many hours of flight, the silence seemed unusual. Molotov and the members of the delegation prepared to disembark. The first stage of the mission was complete. Now the second stage was beginning, no less important and responsible. Negotiations with the British leadership were ahead. Two black cars without identification marks pulled up to the plane. A representative of the Foreign Office emerged from the first car, an elegant middle-aged man in an impeccable suit and bowler hat. He introduced himself briefly and invited the Soviet delegation to follow him. No solemn speeches, no photographers. Everything was extremely businesslike and discreet. The British knew how to observe protocol. But in wartime, secrecy was more important than ceremony. The journey to London took several hours. The cars drove along secondary roads, avoiding large cities and crowds of people.
The escort was unobtrusive but constant.
The special services cars kept their distance, ready to intervene in case of any danger. Molotov looked out the window at the English countryside. Well-tended fields, neat farms, small towns. All this was strikingly different from the war-torn Soviet territories. Here, the war was less noticeable, although its traces were still visible.
In London, the delegation was housed in one of the government buildings.
Not in a hotel. There were too many prying eyes there. The specially equipped apartments were under round-the-clock security. Communication with the outside world was strictly controlled. Even telephone calls to Moscow were made through secret channels. British counterintelligence did not rule out attempts by German agents to obtain information about the negotiations. The security of the Soviet People's Commissar became a headache for MI5. The first meeting with Churchill was scheduled for the next day. The British Prime Minister was at his country residence in Chequers. Molotov was to be taken there in an armored car, accompanied by heavy security. The route was kept secret until the last moment. Even the drivers only learned the direction of travel just before departure.
German aircraft regularly raided London,
but the suburbs were relatively safe. While preparations for the negotiations were underway, Molotov studied the latest reports from the front. The news was alarming. The Germans were completing preparations for a summer offensive. Intelligence reported a concentration of troops in the south. Operation Blau could begin at any day. There was no time for lengthy diplomatic games. Concrete results were needed. Firm commitments on the second front and increased aid. Every day of delay cost thousands of Soviet soldiers' lives. The British press received minimal information about the visit. Only the arrival of the Soviet delegation for consultations on military issues was reported. Molotov's name was not mentioned. No photographs were published. Everything was kept in the spirit of wartime, when secrecy took precedence over openness. German intelligence certainly tried to find out the details of the visit, but the British Secret Services did everything possible to keep it secret. Vyacheslav Mikhailovich spent his first evening in London preparing for a meeting with the legendary British leader. Churchill was famous for his eloquence, stubbornness, and unpredictability. Convincing him of the need to immediately open a second front would be no easy task. The British remembered their defeats in Norway, France, and Greece. They were afraid of repeating those mistakes. But the USSR needed help right now, in the summer of 1942. And Molotov was ready to use every argument to achieve his goal. Wartime London greeted the Soviet delegation without much enthusiasm, but with an understanding of the seriousness of the moment. The city lived in the tense rhythm of war. Blackouts, air raid drills, food rationing. All of this served as reminders of the proximity of the front. But compared to Moscow, which had recently been in direct danger, the British capital seemed like a quiet backwater. Here, it was possible to calmly plan strategy and discuss the future. But would this calm be enough to take decisive action? On the morning of May 28th, Molotov left for Chequers to meet with Winston Churchill. The trip was shrouded in secrecy. A motorcade of 3 cars moved along a pre-checked route. Security cars followed in front and behind. Radio communication was maintained continuously. Any suspicious object on the road could cause a change in route. British intelligence did not rule out the possibility of German sabotage. The elimination of the Soviet People's Commissar would have been a serious success for enemy intelligence. Chequers greeted its guests with its majestic calm. The old English mansion, surrounded by a park, seemed far removed from the turmoil of World War. But it was here that decisions were made that determined the fate of nations. Churchill personally met Molotov at the entrance. The British Prime Minister looked cheerful and energetic, despite his advanced age and the weight of state affairs. His handshake was firm, his gaze searching. 2 experienced politicians were sizing each other up before the start of difficult negotiations. The first conversation was general in nature.
Churchill asked about the situation on the Eastern Front
and was interested in Stalin's opinion on the further development of events. Molotov responded cautiously but informatively.
The Soviet People's Commissar understood perfectly well that his every word would be weighed and analyzed.
The British wanted to understand how critical the situation in the USSR was, and whether the Red Army could withstand a new German attack.
London's willingness to take risks to help its ally depended on this assessment.
Gradually, the conversation turned to specific issues. Molotov outlined Moscow's position on the Second Front. The USSR insisted on the launch of large-scale military operations in Western Europe as early as 1942, preferably in the summer or, at the latest, in the fall. Every month of delay strengthened Germany's position and weakened the Allies.
The Germans are getting a respite,
Transferring troops from west to east and strengthening their defenses on the Atlantic coast. Time is working against the anti-Hitler coalition.
Churchill listened to the Soviet arguments with visible interest, but responded evasively.
The British government is considering various options for intensifying military operations.
There are plans to intensify the bombing of Germany,
and sabotage operations in the occupied countries are possible. But a large-scale invasion across the English Channel is an extremely difficult undertaking.
It requires careful preparation,
the accumulation of forces and resources, and favorable weather conditions. Haste could lead to a disaster similar to Dunkirk. Molotov insisted. The Red Army was holding back the main forces of the Wehrmacht.
More than 200 German divisions were concentrated on the Eastern Front.
If the Allies opened a second front, Hitler would be forced to weaken his Eastern group.
This would give the USSR a respite,
allowing it to build up reserves and prepare for decisive battles. Every German soldier transferred from the east to the west saves the lives of Soviet soldiers. Allied solidarity requires decisive action.
The British Prime Minister objected.
An unsuccessful invasion attempt would do more harm than good. The Germans would strengthen their coastal defenses and gain additional confidence in their forces.
A failed landing would deprive the Allies of a significant part of the forces needed for future operations.
It would be better to wait until the balance of power shifted in favor of the anti-Hitler coalition.
America is ramping up production,
and the British Air Force is gaining strength. Patience is the best strategy. The debate went on for several hours.
Molotov cited figures on Red Army losses
and talked about the heroism of Soviet soldiers dying in an unequal struggle.
Churchill responded with data on the losses of the British fleet,
the difficulties of supplying across the Atlantic, and the threat of German submarines.
Each defended the interests of his country.
But both understood that without mutual support, victory was impossible. Germany was still too strong to be dealt with alone. By evening, the parties had reached preliminary agreements.
Churchill promised to seriously consider the possibility of a major operation in Europe
before the end of the year. He did not specify any specific dates, but pledged to speed up planning and preparation.
Molotov achieved the main thing,
a principled agreement on a second front in 1942. The details were to be discussed with military experts, but the political decision had been made in principle.
But Vyacheslav Mikhailovich understood that verbal promises are easily forgotten.
Written guarantees were needed, documents signed at the highest level. Churchill had so far given only general assurances. Final agreements were still a long way off.
And time was running out.
The fate of the war was being decided on the Eastern Front. Every hour of delay could cost the USSR dearly. The negotiations had to continue,
but it was already clear
that it would be extremely difficult to get the British to take quick and decisive action. The negotiations at Chequers continued the next day.
Churchill invited General Alan Brooke,
Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and other military experts to join the discussion. Now it was time to move from political declarations to concrete plans.
Molotov insisted on precise dates for the opening of the Second Front.
The British generals responded cautiously, citing technical difficulties and the need for additional preparation. The atmosphere in the negotiating room gradually heated up. General Brooke outlined the British point of view from a military standpoint. An invasion across the English Channel requires overwhelming air superiority, a sufficient number of landing craft, and thorough reconnaissance of enemy defenses. It would take at least a year to prepare everything necessary. Attempting to force events could lead to disaster. It would be better to conduct limited operations, landings in North Africa, or on the periphery of the European continent. This would distract German forces without requiring excessive risk. Molotov strongly objected. Peripheral operations would not have the desired effect. Hitler could afford small losses in Africa or the Balkans, but he would not weaken his eastern forces. The Red Army needed real help, a major invasion of northern France that would force the Germans to transfer significant forces from the east. Everything else would be half measures, incapable of changing the strategic situation. The USSR was fighting for its life. The Allies had to understand this. The discussion dragged on for several hours. The British presented calculations of their needs for troops, ships, and aircraft. Molotov responded with data on German divisions on the Eastern Front and the scale of the enemy's upcoming offensive. Each side operated with its own figures and its own logic. But behind the statistics were human lives. Millions of soldiers and civilians whose fates depended on the decisions made in this English mansion. Gradually, a compromise emerged. Churchill proposed a dual strategy. On the one hand, to accelerate preparations for a major invasion of Europe, it would be scheduled for the spring of 1943. But the possibility of earlier action would not be ruled out if circumstances were favorable. On the other hand, an operation would be carried out in North Africa in 1942 to show the Germans that the Allies were active and to draw off some of their forces. Molotov listened to the proposal with obvious skepticism. Spring 1943 is too late. By that time, Germany could achieve decisive success in the east, reach the oil fields of the Caucasus, and force the USSR to make a separate peace. More specific commitments were needed. If not in the summer, then at least in the fall of this year. Serious combat operations should begin in Europe. Otherwise, all assistance could be too late. The negotiations reached an impasse. The British did not want to take on unfulfillable commitments. The Soviet side demanded the impossible from a military point of view. Churchill proposed a break for consultations with the War Cabinet and allies in Washington. The final decision must be made by all members of the anti-Hitler coalition. Britain's unilateral commitments mean little without American support. In a private conversation with Molotov, the British Prime Minister was more candid. England had been fighting the war almost alone for 3 years. The losses of the fleet were enormous, and the economy was stretched to the limit. An unsuccessful invasion attempt could undermine British forces to such an extent that the country would withdraw from the war. Such a risk was unjustified. It would be better to wait until the American military machine was fully engaged. Then the Allies would have every chance of success. Molotov understood the British logic, but could not agree with it. The USSR did not have time to wait. The German offensive would begin any day now. The Red Army had suffered enormous losses and needed a respite. A second front was the only way to force Hitler to spread his forces thin. If the Allies delayed, the USSR might not be able to withstand the blow. And then Germany would gain the resources of all of Eastern Europe and become invincible. By the end of the second day of negotiations, the parties had reached a cautious agreement. Churchill promised to seek American approval for the opening of a second front in 1942. The specific timing and scope of the operation would be determined after consultations in Washington. Molotov was to meet with Roosevelt in person and explain the Soviet position to the American president. Only a joint decision by all the Allies could guarantee success. The formal results of the London talks looked encouraging. An alliance treaty was signed between the USSR and Great Britain. Preliminary agreements were reached on the Second Front. An increase in Lend-Lease aid was promised. But behind the diplomatic rhetoric lay serious disagreements.
The British were ready to help,
but not ready to risk everything to save the USSR. Molotov was to fly to America in the hope of finding a more decisive ally. But would the Americans be ready to do more than the British? On June 1st, Molotov left London for the United States. The transatlantic flight presented new challenges. German submarines were actively operating in the ocean, hunting for Allied convoys. Some of them were equipped with anti-aircraft weapons and could attack low-flying aircraft. In addition, the flight range required refueling in Reykjavik. Each stop increased the risk of the important passenger being discovered by enemy agents. But the journey to America was the only way to convey the Soviet position to Roosevelt. Iceland greeted the Soviet delegation with fog and piercing winds. The American airbase in Reykjavik operated around the clock, ensuring the transfer of troops and cargo across the ocean. Squadrons of long-range bombers, patrol aircraft, and transport aircraft were based here. Molotov spent only a few hours on the island, just enough time to refuel and check the equipment. American officers were hospitable, but the secrecy of the visit was strictly observed. Even the base command received minimal information about the passengers on the Soviet plane. The flight over the Atlantic took more than 10 hours. The B-24 flew at high altitude, using tailwinds to save fuel. Below, the endless ocean stretched out, gray, cold, hostile. Occasionally, the crew noticed traces of ships, white stripes on the dark water. Allied convoys or German raiders? At such an altitude, it was impossible to tell. Radio silence prevented them from ascertaining the situation. All they could do was fly onward, hoping not to encounter the enemy. The American coast appeared on the horizon in the early morning of June 2nd. The crew breathed a sigh of relief. The longest and most dangerous part of the route was behind them. Ahead lay friendly territory, where the Soviet People's Commissar was not threatened by German fighters or submarines. American air traffic controllers directed the plane to a military base near Washington. Everything was already in place to receive the distinguished guest. Secrecy was observed as strictly as in Britain. The meeting at the airport was informal. Representatives of the State Department and the military briefly greeted the Soviet delegation and invited them to follow the cars. Molotov was accommodated in one of the government buildings in downtown Washington. Security was provided by the President's Secret Service. Agents were everywhere, in the corridors, on the streets, in neighboring buildings. America took the protection of its allies' leader with the utmost seriousness. The first meeting with Franklin Roosevelt took place in the afternoon. The American president received Molotov in the Oval Office of the White House. The atmosphere was more informal than in London. Roosevelt was famous for his charm and ability to win over his interlocutors. He was interested not only in military issues, but also in Molotov's personal impressions of the dangerous flight. The American leader clearly sought to create an atmosphere of trust and mutual understanding. The talks began with a discussion of the overall war strategy. Roosevelt confirmed the U.S.'s readiness to increase its military efforts. American industry was working at full capacity, producing weapons for all the Allies. Lend-Lease deliveries would be increased. New bomber squadrons were being prepared for raids on Germany. But when it came to the second front, the American leadership was divided. The president was inclined toward active measures, but the generals insisted on caution. Molotov presented the Americans with the same argument he had presented to the British. The USSR was bearing the brunt of the war with Germany. The Red Army was holding back more than 200 German divisions. Without a second front, the Soviet Union might not be able to withstand a new attack by the Wehrmacht. Every day of delay costs thousands of lives. Allied solidarity requires decisive action right now, in the summer of 1942. America has the resources necessary for a major operation in Europe. Roosevelt listened to the Soviet arguments with visible sympathy. The American president understood global strategy better than many military leaders. He realized that the defeat of the USSR would radically change the balance of power in the world. Germany would gain the resources of all of Eastern Europe and become virtually invincible. Therefore, helping the Soviet Union was in the interests of the United States itself. But military experts insisted on more time for preparation. An unsuccessful operation could discredit the idea of a second front for a long time. By the end of the first day of negotiations, Molotov had received more encouraging signals than he had in London. Roosevelt was ready to consider the possibility of a major operation as early as 1942. But the final decision had to be made jointly with the British, and after consultation with the American generals. The president promised to speed up planning and preparation. Specific dates would be announced in the coming weeks. This was more than the British had offered, but still less than the USSR demanded. The American capital made a contradictory impression on Molotov. On the one hand, there was power and scale. Factories worked day and night, producing tanks, planes, and ships. Ports were jammed with transports bound for the Allies. One could sense the enormous potential of a country that was just beginning to deploy its military machine. On the other hand, the war here seemed distant and abstract. The Americans had not experienced the horrors of occupation, bombing, or starvation. It was more difficult for them to understand the desperation of the USSR, which needed immediate help. Convincing them to act decisively was no less difficult than with the British. Negotiations in Washington continued, with the involvement of the American military leadership. Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall and other high-ranking military officials joined the discussion. The atmosphere was businesslike, but more open than in Britain. The Americans were less formal and got to the point more quickly. Molotov sensed this difference and adjusted his tactics accordingly. It was possible to speak directly with the Americans without resorting to diplomatic euphemisms. General Marshall outlined the American view of the war strategy. The U.S. was ready for decisive action, but considered it necessary to concentrate maximum forces before the start of the operation. It was better to conduct one powerful operation with a guarantee of success than several small ones with dubious results. American military doctrine preferred massive strikes based on technical superiority. Such preparation took time, but promised a decisive victory. Molotov objected, using the same arguments he had used in London. Time was working against the Allies. Every month of delay strengthened Germany and weakened the USSR. The Red Army was bleeding to death, holding back the main forces of the Wehrmacht. If the Allies did not open a second front in the summer, it might be too late in the fall. The Germans would break through to the oil fields of the Caucasus and gain a strategic advantage. The USSR would find itself in a critical situation from which it would be extremely difficult to escape. The American generals listened carefully to the Soviet arguments. They understood better than the British the importance of the Eastern Front for the overall war strategy. The defeat of the USSR would indeed radically change the situation. Germany would free up enormous forces to defend its western borders. An invasion of Europe would become immeasurably more difficult. Therefore, helping the Soviet Union was in American interests. But military capabilities have their limitations, which cannot be ignored. Gradually, the outlines of a compromise emerged. Roosevelt proposed a two-stage plan. The first stage was to accelerate preparations for a major invasion of Europe, scheduled for the spring of 1943. At the same time, arms and materials supplies to the USSR would be maximized. The second stage was to conduct a limited operation as early as 1942, possibly in North Africa, to force the Germans to disperse their forces. Molotov demanded more specific commitments. Spring 1943 was too late. Action was needed this fall. Even if it was not a full-scale invasion of France, at least a major operation in Norway or the Balkans, something that would really divert significant German forces from the Eastern Front. An operation in Africa would not have such an effect. Germany had relatively few troops there. The USSR needed real help, not symbolic gestures. The discussions continued for several days.
The Americans showed Molotov's statistics on arms production and plans to build up the army and navy.
The figures were impressive. The US was indeed becoming an arsenal of democracy, capable of arming all its allies.
But it would take time to turn this potential into real combat power.
Soldiers had to be trained, equipment had to be debugged, and logistics had to be worked out. War is not only about enthusiasm, but also about cold calculation of capabilities.
The Soviet side presented its arguments.
Molotov spoke of the heroism of the defenders of Moscow and Leningrad, of the millions of civilians who died under German occupation.
He showed maps with the location of German troops and explained the Wehrmacht's plans for the summer of 1942.
Every Soviet soldier who died in battle bought time for the Allies. But this resource was not infinite.
Sooner or later,
the USSR might not be able to withstand the strain. By the end of the negotiations, the parties had reached certain agreements. Roosevelt promised to seek the British's consent for more decisive action.
There were plans to create a joint headquarters for planning operations in Europe.
Lend-Lease supplies would be significantly increased. A major operation in the Mediterranean in the fall of 1942 was being considered as an interim measure.
This was not what the USSR wanted,
but it was more than the British had offered. Molotov's personal impressions of the American leader were generally positive.
Roosevelt gave the impression of a man who understood the global situation
and was ready for decisive action. Unlike the cautious Churchill, the American president was not afraid to take risks. But even he could not act alone.
Behind him stood the generals,
Congress, and public opinion. Convincing America to move from arms production to active combat proved more difficult than expected. Molotov prepared for the return journey with mixed feelings.
Formally,
the mission had been successful. Agreements on an alliance had been reached. Increased aid had been promised, and assurances had been obtained about a second front. But no specific dates were given.
The USSR still stood alone against the main forces of the Wehrmacht.
The Allies' aid was important, but insufficient to radically change the situation. The Red Army had to withstand another German attack on its own.
Whether it would succeed remained to be seen in the near future.
The issue of Lend-Lease took up a significant part of the negotiations in Washington.
The Soviet Union was in dire need of increased supplies of military equipment,
strategic raw materials, and food.
Molotov had detailed lists of the most critical needs:
aircraft, tanks, trucks, locomotives, aluminum for the aviation industry, high-octane gasoline, and medical supplies. Each item was justified by the real needs of the front and the rear.
The USSR was fighting a war of attrition,
and external aid was becoming increasingly critical. The Americans responded to the Soviet requests with understanding.
Roosevelt personally oversaw the Lend-Lease program
and viewed it as a vital foreign policy tool.
By helping the Allies with weapons and materials,
the U.S. gained the ability to influence the course of the war without incurring direct losses in manpower. This was in line with American interests and public opinion.
Most Americans supported helping the victims of Nazi aggression,
but did not want to send their sons to die in European trenches. Detailed discussions on supplies were held with the participation of experts.
Representatives of the military and industry
studied Soviet requests and compared them with production capabilities. Some items could be increased immediately.
Others required the restructuring of production lines
or the redistribution of already planned supplies. Others proved impossible due to technical limitations or a lack of raw materials. Each item was discussed separately.
Particular attention was paid to aviation technology.
The USSR was in dire need of modern fighters and bombers. German aviation still had a qualitative advantage on most sections of the front.
American aircraft could turn the tide in the air,
providing Soviet pilots with machines that were not inferior to Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs.
Roosevelt promised to significantly increase deliveries of P-39 Airacobra fighters and to consider the possibility of transferring more modern types.
Tanks were another critical category. Soviet industry produced enough combat vehicles, but their quality often left much to be desired. American Shermans surpassed most Soviet tanks in reliability and crew comfort. British Matildas and Valentines had already proven themselves in the battles near Moscow. Increased deliveries of armored vehicles could significantly strengthen the Red Army's striking power. The Americans agreed to consider the possibility of additional deliveries. Trucks were perhaps the most important category of aid. The Red Army was experiencing an acute shortage of motor transport. Studebakers, Dodges, and other American vehicles became the backbone of Soviet military logistics. Without them, supplying troops with food, ammunition, and fuel would have been extremely difficult. Molotov was particularly insistent on increasing vehicle deliveries, understanding their key role in ensuring troop mobility. Strategic raw materials posed a separate problem. The USSR was in dire need of aluminum for the aviation industry, copper for electrical engineering, and rubber for car tires. Many deposits were in German hands or had been evacuated deep into the rear. American supplies made it possible to keep the defense industry running. Roosevelt promised to increase supplies of critically important materials, despite the needs of the growing American army. Food aid was of particular importance. The blockade of Leningrad, the occupation of fertile areas of Ukraine, and the evacuation of the agricultural population created an acute food shortage. American corned beef, powdered milk, and grain helped feed not only the army, but also the civilian population. Molotov spoke of the famine in besieged Leningrad and of children dying of exhaustion. These arguments made a strong impression on American listeners. The logistics of delivery created additional difficulties. The northern sea route via Murmansk was the shortest, but also the most dangerous. German planes and submarines based in Norway regularly attacked convoys. The losses were enormous. Sometimes up to half of the ships did not reach their destination. The Far Eastern route was safer but took much longer. The Persian corridor through Iran was just beginning to operate and had limited capacity. By the end of the negotiations, a protocol was signed to significantly increase Lend-Lease supplies. The total amount of aid was to almost double. Particular attention was paid to aviation equipment, motor transport, and strategic raw materials. The Americans undertook to find additional means of transport for the delivery of goods. The USSR received important support to continue the war. But would it be enough to defeat the German war machine? That was to be determined on the battlefields. Molotov was generally satisfied with the agreements reached on Lend-Lease. The Americans showed their willingness to provide real help and their understanding of Soviet needs. Unlike the cautious British, they were generous with their promises to increase supplies. True, the fulfillment of these promises depended on many factors: production capacity, the availability of transport, and the military situation on the communications lines. But the political will to help the USSR had been convincingly demonstrated. This gave grounds for cautious optimism. On June 11, Molotov left the American capital, heading back home. The flight across the Atlantic again posed serious risks. German submarines continued to actively hunt for Allied convoys. Enemy radio intelligence could intercept communications with ground services. Any technical malfunction over the ocean threatened disaster. But there was no other way to get to the USSR. Land routes through Asia would take months, and the results of the negotiations had to be reported to Stalin as soon as possible. The B-24 took off from the American base early in the morning. The weather was favorable: clear skies, tailwinds, good visibility. The crew felt confident after the successful experience of the first flight. Molotov and the members of the delegation seemed satisfied with the results of the negotiations. Not everything had been achieved, but progress was evident. Lend-Lease deliveries promised to increase significantly. The second front remained a vague prospect, but movement in the right direction was noticeable. The first half of the flight was uneventful. The plane flew at high altitude, using jet streams to save fuel. Below, the endless ocean stretched out. Occasionally, the crew spotted ships, tiny dots on the blue surface. Allied convoys or German raiders, it was impossible to tell from such a height. Radio silence made it impossible to ascertain the situation. They had to rely solely on luck and the skill of the pilots. Around noon, an event occurred that could change everything. The flight engineer reported a malfunction in one of the engines. The RPM was dropping, and the oil temperature was rising. Perhaps the filter was clogged, or the engine was running low on oil. In any case, the engine was running erratically and could stall at any moment. The commander decided to descend and prepare to fly on 3 engines. The situation was complicated by the fact that the nearest airfield was hundreds of kilometers away. Landing on water meant almost certain death. No one could survive more than a few minutes in the cold waters of the Atlantic. All that remained was to hope that the faulty engine would hold out until they reached land. The crew worked smoothly, checking the systems and preparing for emergency procedures. Molotov remained calm on the outside, but understood the seriousness of the situation. Fortunately, the engine did not stall completely. It was running intermittently, but there was enough thrust to maintain flight. Gradually, the coast of Iceland appeared on the horizon. The American base in Reykjavik was ready to receive the emergency aircraft. Air traffic controllers cleared the airspace, and rescue services were put on standby. The landing was successful, albeit with some technical difficulties. At the Icelandic base, the plane was thoroughly inspected. It turned out that one of the engines did indeed need repair. The work would take several hours. Molotov took advantage of the forced stop to rest and reflect on the results of the trip. The Americans made a more favorable impression on him than the British. Roosevelt seemed to be a more decisive leader, ready for action. But even he could not give firm guarantees of the immediate opening of a second front. By evening, the repairs were completed. The B-24 took to the air again, heading for the USSR. Ahead lay the most dangerous part of the return route. The flight across the Norwegian Sea past German bases, but the crew already had experience of such a flight. The weather was favorable, cloud cover hid the plane from observers, and visibility was limited. This made navigation difficult, but provided the necessary camouflage. The flight over the Barents Sea passed without incident. German patrols did not detect the Soviet aircraft. Perhaps they were lucky with the weather, or perhaps the Luftwaffe simply did not expect a single bomber to appear in this area. In any case, the most dangerous part of the route was safely completed. Ahead lay the territory of the USSR, friendly, but not entirely safe due to possible raids by German aircraft. On June 25, a month after the start of the mission, Molotov returned to Moscow. He was met without fanfare. Secrecy was maintained until the end. Only a small circle of top leaders knew about the People's Commissar's return. Stalin was waiting for a detailed report on the results of the negotiations. The fate of the country largely depended on whether it was possible to get real commitments from the Allies on the Second Front and increased aid. The first meeting with Stalin took place on the same day. Molotov gave a detailed account of the negotiations in London and Washington. The British were cautious and unwilling to take risks for the sake of the USSR. The Americans were more active, but also did not give firm guarantees of a quick opening of the Second Front. Lend-Lease would be significantly increased, which was a positive result. But the main goal, to force the Allies to take immediate action, had not been achieved. The USSR remained alone in facing the main forces of the German war machine. Stalin listened to the report without showing any emotion. The results were expected. The Western Allies are not ready to sacrifice their interests for the sake of saving the USSR. They prefer to fight with someone else's hands, limiting themselves to supplying weapons and materials. But even that is better than nothing. The increase in Lend-Lease will help the Red Army withstand the upcoming battles. And the Second Front would open when the Allies realized that without it, they too could lose the war. While Molotov was negotiating with the Allies, the situation on the Eastern Front continued to deteriorate. On June 28th, German troops began Operation Blau, a general offensive in the south. The main strike was directed at Stalingrad and the Caucasus. Hitler sought to capture the oil fields of Baku and cut off the USSR's most important communications. The success of this operation could decide the outcome of the entire war. The Red Army faced its most serious test since the beginning of the conflict. The German command concentrated the best divisions of the Wehrmacht for the offensive. Army Group South was reinforced with tank units transferred from other sections of the front. Air support reached its maximum intensity. The Luftwaffe dominated the air in most directions. Soviet troops, weakened by previous battles and the disaster near Kharkov, struggled to hold back the enemy's advance. The front line began to rapidly retreat eastward. In Moscow, events were being followed with alarm. Stalin demanded that front commanders stand their ground to the death and not give an inch of land to the enemy. But reality was harsher than the calls. The German war machine still surpassed the Soviet one in terms of the quality of equipment, training of personnel, and organization of inter-service cooperation. The Red Army learned to fight during the war itself, paying a huge price for its lessons. Every day brought new losses and new retreats. The results of Molotov's mission were becoming particularly relevant. An increase in Lend-Lease supplies could help the Red Army hold out at a critical moment. American tanks, aircraft, and trucks were urgently needed to restore the combat capability of the Soviet troops. But delivery would take time, and the enemy was already advancing. A second front could have forced the Germans to weaken their eastern group, but the Allies were still delaying concrete decisions. The situation was particularly dire near Stalingrad. German troops were pushing toward the Volga, seeking to cut off the USSR's most important transport artery. The city bore the name of the Soviet leader, and its fall would have not only strategic, but also enormous political significance. Stalin ordered Stalingrad to be defended at all costs. Reserves were urgently transferred there. New units were formed, and all possible resources were mobilized. At the same time, the Germans were pushing towards the oil fields of the Caucasus. The capture of Maykop, Grozny, and especially Baku would have deprived the USSR of its main sources of fuel. Without oil, tanks and planes become piles of scrap metal. Aircraft cannot fly, and mechanized units lose their mobility. The Germans understood this perfectly well and sent elite mountain divisions to the Caucasus. The Soviet command tried to organize a defense in the mountains, but there were catastrophically insufficient forces. In the northern sectors of the front, the situation remained relatively stable. The blockade of Leningrad continued, but the Germans made no active attempts to storm the city. Army Group Center also did not show much activity, limiting itself to isolated operations. The main forces of the Wehrmacht were concentrated in the south. This gave the Red Army the opportunity to transfer reserves from passive areas to threatened directions. But reserves were limited, and the front stretched for thousands of kilometers. In these conditions, every promise made by the Allies became particularly valuable. Molotov regularly contacted Churchill and Roosevelt, reminding them of the critical situation on the Eastern Front. He insisted on speeding up arms deliveries and demanded specific dates for the opening of a second front. Western leaders expressed sympathy, but still took no concrete action. The Allies preferred to wait and see, hoping that the USSR would be able to hold out on its own. July and August 1942 were months of severe trials for the Soviet Union. German troops advanced towards Stalingrad, captured Caucasian cities, and threatened oil fields. It seemed that the USSR would soon collapse under the weight of the blows. But the Red Army continued to resist. Soldiers and officers who remembered the retreat of 1941 understood that there was nowhere else to retreat. There was no land beyond the Volga. They had to stand their ground to the death. Gradually, the results of Molotov's negotiations began to take effect. American supplies increased. Ships carrying tanks, aircraft, and trucks arrived at Soviet ports. Lend-Lease was becoming more and more effective, despite the loss of convoys in the Arctic. Every American Sherman or Airacobra strengthened the power of the Red Army. But equipment was not everything. Trained crews, well-organized supplies, and competent command were needed. And most importantly, an unshakable will to resist. Stalin closely monitored the situation at the front and behind the scenes of diplomacy. He understood that the Allies would only open a second front when they realized that without it, they themselves could lose the war. As long as they believed that the USSR could hold out on its own, there would be no active action. This meant that it was necessary to prove their strength and show that the Red Army was capable not only of defending itself, but also of attacking. A counteroffensive was being prepared near Stalingrad. Its success would determine not only the fate of the city on the Volga, but also the West's readiness to take decisive action against Germany. Molotov's mission laid the foundations for future cooperation between the Allies, but its main fruits would be reaped later. For the time being, the USSR fought mainly on its own, relying on the courage of its soldiers and the skill of its commanders. The help of the Allies was important, but it did not solve all the problems. Victory depended on the Red Army's ability to hold out at the most critical moment of the war and launch a counteroffensive. The summer of 1942 became a test of the strength of the entire Soviet military machine. In the fall of 1942, the situation at the front began to gradually change. The German offensive ran out of steam. The Wehrmacht got bogged down in street fighting in Stalingrad and failed to break through to the Baku oil fields. The Red Army learned to fight and gathered strength for a decisive strike. Lend-Lease supplies, negotiated by Molotov, began to have a significant impact on the combat effectiveness of Soviet troops. American tanks, aircraft, and trucks changed the quality of the Red Army, making it more mobile and technically equipped. On November 19, a counter-offensive began near Stalingrad. Operation Uranus became the first major victory of the USSR over the German war machine. An entire enemy army was surrounded. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the strategic initiative passed to the Red Army. The world saw that the Soviet Union was not only capable of defending itself, but could also deliver crushing blows to the enemy. This radically changed the perception of the USSR by its Western allies. Churchill and Roosevelt closely followed the events at Stalingrad. The success of the Red Army showed that the USSR remained in the war and was capable of active action. This meant that aid to the Soviet Union was justified and effective. At the same time, Western leaders realized that if they did not open a second front in time, the USSR could defeat Germany on its own. And then the post-war structure of Europe would be determined by Stalin, not them. In November 1942, the Allies carried out Operation Torch, a landing in North Africa. It was the first major joint operation by American and British troops against the Axis powers. Its scale was limited compared to the fighting on the Eastern Front, but its political significance was enormous. The Western Allies finally moved from words to action, launching active ground operations against Germany and its satellites. Molotov watched the developments with satisfaction. His mission in the spring of 1942 laid the foundation for these successes. The Lend-Lease agreements helped the Red Army hold out at a critical moment and go on the offensive. Pressure on the Allies regarding the Second Front forced them to step up planning for their own operations. Of course, the landing in Africa was not yet an invasion of France, but it was a step in the right direction. The winter of 1942-1943 was marked by Soviet victories. The Red Army advanced on all fronts, liberating occupied territories. The blockade of Leningrad was partially broken. The Germans were retreating, suffering huge losses. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility was crumbling before the eyes of the whole world. The USSR was transforming from a victim of aggression into a formidable military power capable of dictating its own terms. In the spring of 1943, the Big Three met in Tehran: Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt gathered for the first time to discuss war strategy and the post-war world order. Molotov attended the talks as the USSR's foreign minister. His experience in dealing with Western leaders proved invaluable. He knew the strengths and weaknesses of each of them and understood their motives and fears. At the Tehran conference, a final decision was made to open a second front. Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings, was scheduled for the summer of 1944. This was later than the USSR wanted, but better late than never. The Western Allies finally made specific commitments to large-scale military action against Germany. The war was entering a decisive phase. Molotov understood that his risky flight in the spring of 1942 had laid the foundations for the anti-Hitler coalition. Without personal contacts with Churchill and Roosevelt, without demonstrating the USSR's willingness to make any sacrifices for victory, the Allies could have continued to limit themselves to supplying weapons. Diplomacy required not only the ability to persuade, but also the willingness to risk one's life for the interests of the country. The war continued for another 2 years after Molotov's mission. The second front was opened, as promised by the Allies. Lend-Lease supplies continued until the very end of the war. The USSR received not only material assistance, but also recognition as an equal partner in the anti-Hitler coalition. This largely predetermined the post-war world order, in which the Soviet Union became one of the leading powers. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended with a complete victory for the Allies. Vyacheslav Molotov, who risked his life to strengthen the anti-Hitler coalition, also contributed to this victory. His flight across occupied Europe became a symbol of the USSR's determination to see things through to the end, regardless of the dangers. History has shown that sometimes diplomacy requires no less courage than war. Looking back, we can say that Molotov's mission was a success. Not everything was achieved immediately, but the long-term results exceeded expectations. The USSR gained recognition as a great power, material assistance for waging war, and guarantees of the Allies' participation in the fight against fascism. The price was high, the risk of losing one of the country's top leaders. But history knows no subjunctive mood. In May 1942, this risk was justified. And Molotov justified it.